Most people know what D-Day was, but almost no one knows what it actually looked like from the ground. Not from the beaches, not from the landing craft, from the fields, from the hedgerows, from the darkened windows of farmhouses where French men and women had spent 4 years waiting, hiding, fighting, and dying in silence. When the paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions fell out of the sky in the early hours of June 6, 1944, it wasn't just an Allied military operation. It was the moment thousands of ordinary French people had been praying for, dreaming about, and in many cases, risking everything to make possible. And what happened when those two worlds collided, when exhausted American boys in full combat gear came face to face with resistance fighters who had been living double lives for years, is one of the most human stories of the entire war. And almost no one talks about it. If this is the kind of history that actually matters to you, stick around and make sure you subscribe because we go deep on stories like this one all the time. What you're about to hear isn't the Hollywood version. It's what really happened, told through real accounts, real voices, and real moments that no film has ever fully captured. To understand what the French felt when the paratroopers landed, you first have to understand what the years before that night had done to them. And that story begins not in June of 1944, but in June of 1940. When France fell to Nazi Germany in just 6 weeks, it wasn't just a military defeat, it was a psychological catastrophe. The country had believed its army was one of the best in the world. It had believed the Maginot Line was impenetrable. It had believed Germany could be stopped, and then, in less time than it takes to finish a school semester, it was all over. The Nazi flag flew over Paris. Marshal Philippe Pétain, a hero of the First World War, announced an armistice and told the French people that this was the responsible choice. Collaboration, he said, was better than continued destruction. For millions of French citizens, that message landed in very different ways. Some accepted it, some even welcomed it, but others, a smaller number at first, burned with fury at what they saw as a national betrayal. Among those others was a man named Charles de Gaulle, a relatively obscure brigadier general who flew to London and made a radio broadcast on June 18, 1940, that would define a generation. He said the flame of French resistance must not go out and shall not go out. At the time, almost no one in France heard it. BBC reception was poor. German troops were actively suppressing radio signals. But the word spread anyway, whispered from one person to the next, scrawled on walls, passed in notes, until something remarkable began to happen. People started organizing. The French resistance was never one thing. That's one of the most important and most misunderstood facts about it. It wasn't a single unified army with a command structure and clear ranks. It was a constellation of networks, some connected to de Gaulle's Free French in London, some connected to the communists, some connected to the British SOE, some connected to nobody but themselves. They had different politics, different methods, different priorities. Some focused on intelligence gathering, passing information about German troop movements to Allied commanders. Some focused on sabotage, cutting railway lines, blowing up bridges, destroying fuel depots. Some ran escape networks, hiding Allied airmen who'd been shot down and smuggling them back to Britain through Spain. Some printed underground newspapers, keeping a version of truth alive in a country where the official press was controlled by the occupiers. And some simply waited, gathering weapons, training in secret, preparing for the day when they would be called to rise. That day, they had been told again and again, would come. Radio London, the BBC's French language service, broadcast coded messages every night that resistance members listened to in secret, curtains drawn, volume low, ears straining. Those messages were instructions. They were confirmation that the Allies hadn't forgotten them, and they were, for many people, the only thing that kept hope alive through 4 of the longest years any of them had ever lived. But hope came at a catastrophic price. The Gestapo and the Milice, France's own collaborationist police force, hunted resistance members with relentless efficiency. The networks were infiltrated repeatedly. Entire cells were rolled up in a single night. Men and women were tortured in basements and interrogation rooms. Some broke, some didn't. Some were shot, some were sent to concentration camps. By 1944, the resistance had lost hundreds of its most experienced leaders. Jean Moulin, de Gaulle's chosen representative in France who had worked tirelessly to unify the different networks, was arrested, tortured, and killed in 1943. His loss was devastating. But the networks kept going. because the people in them understood something with absolute clarity. If they stopped, the occupation would never end, and so they kept going. By the spring of 1944, the resistance knew something was coming. They didn't know exactly when, they didn't know exactly where. But the scale of Allied preparations in England was an open secret among those paying close attention. The BBC messages had been increasing in frequency and intensity. The SOE was parachuting in more agents, more weapons, more explosives. The networks were being activated, put on standby, told to be ready. And then, on the night of June 5, 1944, the BBC broadcast a message that stopped hearts across occupied France. It came from a Paul Verlaine poem. The first line, Les sanglots longs des violons de l'automne, the long sobs of the violins of autumn, had been broadcast weeks earlier. It meant, prepare yourselves, something is coming. The second line, broadcast on the night of June 5th, was the real signal, blessant mon cœur d'une langueur monotone. It means, wound my heart with a monotonous languor. And it meant, begin immediately. For the resistance fighters who heard it, those words were not poetry. They were an earthquake. In the Normandy region specifically, the networks had been preparing for this moment with particular intensity. The area was strategically crucial, and both the Allies and the resistance knew it. There were men and women who had spent months memorizing road networks, identifying German positions, tracking troop movements, and relaying that information to London. There were groups who had received weapons drops in the fields at night, burying crates of Sten guns and ammunition under barns and in haystacks. There were individuals who had spent years cultivating cover identities, so convincing that their own neighbors sometimes didn't know who they really were. When the signal came through on the night of June 5th, the resistance in Normandy began to move. They activated their plans. They took up positions. They prepared to do their part. What none of them had been fully prepared for was the sensory reality of what was about to happen. Because you can know something is coming. You can plan for it, prepare for it, long for it, with every part of yourself. But when the sky fills with the sound of engines, when the drone of aircraft builds from a distant rumble to a roar that shakes the walls and rattles the windows, and when the darkness above begins to bloom with parachutes, the experience of that moment is something no preparation can fully account for. Michel de Valavielle was a member of a resistance network operating in the Manche department of Normandy. He had been active since 1941, first carrying messages, then organizing supply drops, then working directly with Allied intelligence. On the night of June 5th, he had received the signal and was in position in a field near Saint-Mère-Église when the planes began to come over. Decades later, he described the moment in an account that has been preserved in French oral history archives. He said he had heard aircraft many times before during the occupation. German aircraft, Allied bombers passing high overhead on their way to targets further east. He knew what aircraft sounded like, but this was different. This was not a distant rumble fading into the distance. This was a tide of sound that kept building and building until it felt like the sky itself was made of engines. And then he looked up, and he said the word he used, the word he came back to again and again when he told this story, was innombrable, uncountable. There were so many aircraft that the darkness above him seemed to be moving. The sky was alive, and then the shapes started to fall. Dark forms against a dark sky, impossible to see clearly at first. And then as they descended, the canopies catching whatever faint light existed and blooming open, one after another, until the air above the fields of Normandy was filled with men falling toward the earth. He said he couldn't speak for a long moment. He just stood there and watched, and the thought that went through his mind, the thought he would carry with him for the rest of his life, was simply this: Ils sont venus. They came. That phrase, in its simplest possible form, carries the weight of 4 years. 4 years of occupation, 4 years of danger, 4 years of watching people he knew be arrested and disappear, 4 years of coded messages and secret meetings, and the constant grinding fear that lived in the chest of everyone who was part of the resistance like a stone that never went away. They came. It sounds like almost nothing, and it was everything. He wasn't the only one. Across the drop zones of Normandy, resistance members who had been in position, who had been waiting, experienced similar moments when the enormity of what was happening broke through every layer of discipline and preparation and simply stunned them. Geneviève Dubois was not a fighter in the traditional sense. She was a nurse who had been working with a resistance network that operated out of the Caen region, providing medical support for members who were wounded and could not be taken to official hospitals without triggering questions about how they'd been hurt. She had spent the night of June 5th at a farmhouse used as a safe house, listening to the radio with two other network members. When the signal came through, they had gone outside to watch. She described looking up and seeing the sky, and not being able to understand at first what she was seeing. She had expected something. She had been told to expect something, but the reality of it was beyond what her imagination had constructed. She said it looked like the sky was giving birth, like something was being born above them that had never existed before. And when the first parachutes resolved themselves into men, into actual human beings with legs and weapons and American uniforms, she said she felt something she had not felt in 4 years. She felt that the world was going to be all right. She also said she cried. She wasn't embarrassed about it. She said everyone cried. But not every encounter that night was transcendent. The 82nd and 101st Airborne had launched into one of the most chaotic combat jumps in military history. The weather had been difficult. German anti-aircraft fire had scattered the formations. Pilots had taken evasive action. Equipment had malfunctioned. Men had come down miles from their intended drop zones. Some had landed in flooded fields and drowned before they could free themselves from their parachutes. Some had landed on rooftops. Some had been shot before they hit the ground, and many had landed alone, or in small scattered groups, in unfamiliar terrain, in the dark, with no immediate idea of where they were, where their unit was, or whether anyone in this field, this road, this farmyard was going to help them or kill them. For those men, the French civilians and resistance fighters they encountered in those first terrifying hours were not a backdrop to a grand moment. They were the difference between life and death. Corporal James Flanagan of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne, came down in an orchard several kilometers from his intended drop zone. He had lost his rifle on landing. He had a pistol and a knife. He had no idea where he was. He moved carefully through the orchard, trying to get his bearings, until he heard movement nearby and went completely still. The movement continued. Something or someone was moving toward him through the trees. He had his hand on the pistol. He was ready to fire, and then a voice spoke, barely above a whisper, in accented English. "American? You are American?" He said he nearly passed out from relief. The man who found him was a farmer named Auguste Leroux, who was also a member of a local resistance cell. Leroux had been in his fields that night, specifically because of the BBC signal. He had been watching for exactly this. He had found 3 other paratroopers in the previous hour and had led them to a barn where they were sheltering. He led Flanagan there too. In the barn, 4 Americans, none of whom knew where they were, none of whom had been in contact with their units, sat in the dark while a French farmer, with a hand-drawn map and 4 years of intimate knowledge of every road, track, and German position in the area, told them exactly where they were, where the Germans were, and the fastest way to get to where they needed to go. Flanagan later said that without Leroux, he was not sure any of them would have survived the morning. Leroux was not exceptional. He was representative. Across Normandy, in those first hours, this scene played out again and again in different versions. American paratroopers, many of them teenagers, many of them separated from their units, many of them injured, disoriented, and terrified, encountered French men and women who could have ignored them, who could have gone back inside and closed their doors, who could have chosen not to get involved. And instead, those French people risked everything they had, because being caught helping an Allied soldier in occupied France was a death sentence, not just for yourself, but potentially for your entire family. Henri Fouché was 19 years old in June of 1944. He lived in a village near Saint-Mère-Église and had been involved in the resistance for just over a year, primarily running messages between cells. He was not armed. He had no military training to speak of. He was a boy who had made a choice that he was not going to stand by and do nothing while his country was occupied. On the night of June 5th, he was in a field with 2 older men from his cell when the planes came over. He described looking up and seeing a parachute catch fire. Someone had been hit. He watched the burning shape fall and impact the ground not far away. He ran to it. The man inside was an American soldier, already dead when Henri reached him. He had never seen a dead man before. He said he stood over him for a moment that seemed to last longer than it should have, and he thought about all the distance that man had traveled to be here, in this field, in Normandy, and he thought that it seemed impossible that he had come so far and not made it. He took the man's dog tags, not to steal them, but because he understood that they might be needed later to identify him, and he buried him as best he could at the edge of the field. Later that night, Henri led a group of 7 paratroopers through 5 kilometers of German-held countryside to a resistance safe house. He did it without weapons, relying on 4 years of walking those roads, knowing where the German sentries were posted, knowing which routes were never patrolled, knowing the landscape the way only someone who grew up in it can know it. The Americans followed him in silence, trusting a 19-year-old French boy they had never met with their lives. He got all 7 of them there. The language barrier was its own story. Very few of the American paratroopers spoke French. Very few of the French civilians and resistance members spoke English. And in the chaos of those first hours, communication often had to happen through gesture, through drawing in the dirt, through the universal language of maps and hand signals, and pointing urgently in the right direction. There were moments of terrible misunderstanding. There were moments of unexpected comedy. There were moments where 2 people from completely different worlds managed to communicate something profound without sharing a single word. Private Thomas Wyatt from Georgia had grown up speaking English and approximately 12 words of what he described as church Latin from a Catholic school I barely attended. He landed in a cow pasture and immediately encountered an elderly French woman named Marguerite Alençon, who had come out of her farmhouse when the planes went over, carrying a lantern that she was swinging deliberately in a pattern that she hoped would signal that it was safe to approach. Wyatt described approaching her with his rifle raised, heart pounding, not knowing if the light was a signal or a trap. She looked at him, looked at his rifle, looked back at his face, and then she reached out and put her hand over the barrel and gently pushed it down. Then she gestured for him to follow her inside. She fed him bread and cheese and cold coffee. She had no English. He had no French. But he said she patted his arm 3 times and said something he didn't understand, and her face when she said it made him want to cry. He asked a French interpreter later, after the liberation, if he could describe the phrase and have it translated. He couldn't remember the exact words, but he described the tone of it as something like, "We knew you would come. We knew you would come." The relationship between the French resistance and Allied planners had been complicated and often contentious in the years leading up to D-Day. The British and Americans had different views on how useful the resistance actually was, how much they could be trusted, and how much operational detail they should be given. The fundamental problem was the same one that always exists when you're trying to coordinate clandestine networks from thousands of miles away. Too much information sharing risked compromise. If a resistance network was penetrated, and they were penetrated regularly, everything that network knew became something the Germans knew. So the Allies had been deliberately vague about timing, about locations, about specific objectives. The resistance knew something was coming. They knew it would be big. They knew they needed to be ready. But the precise operational details of Operation Overlord, including the fact that the main invasion would be in Normandy, had been guarded so closely that many resistance fighters only understood what was happening when the sky above them filled with paratroopers. This created its own kind of emotional charge in the encounters of that night, because these were people who had been working in the dark, often literally, for years. They had been given pieces of information and told to act on them without always knowing the full picture. They had made sacrifices without knowing if those sacrifices were contributing to something real, or whether the Allies would ever actually come. And now, suddenly, in a matter of minutes, the uncertainty of 4 years resolved itself into the overwhelming, undeniable, physical reality of thousands of armed men falling from the sky. Fernand Duchamp was the leader of a mid-sized resistance cell in the Cotentin Peninsula. He was a former school teacher, in his mid-40s, a careful and methodical man who had built his network slowly and kept it intact through several Gestapo sweeps by being extremely disciplined about security. He had been one of the organizers of a series of sabotage operations targeting railway lines in the weeks before D-Day, timed to coincide with Allied bombing campaigns and designed to disrupt German supply movements. He had received the BBC signal on the night of June 5th and had activated his cell. They were in position near a crossroads that they had been told to hold and secure when the first wave of paratroopers began to come down. He had expected to be busy. What he had not expected was the feeling that hit him when he actually saw them. He said he had spent so long thinking about what liberation would look like in the abstract, what it would feel like as an idea, that he had never quite connected it to a concrete physical moment. And then the concrete physical moment arrived, and he was completely overwhelmed by it. This teacher, this careful and methodical man who had survived 4 years of occupation through self-discipline and emotional control, said he had to turn away from the men in his cell for a moment because he didn't want them to see his face. He needed a moment that was just for him. He looked up at the sky, full of parachutes, and he thought, it's real. It's actually real. But that feeling, that surge of hope and relief and vindication, had to coexist with the brutal operational reality of what was still happening around them, because the paratroopers were not landing in neat formations on prepared landing zones. They were scattered. They were confused. They were under fire. German anti-aircraft guns were still firing. German ground troops were already moving to intercept, and the resistance had their own assignments, their own targets, their own responsibilities. The emotional experience of that night happened in parallel with very practical, very dangerous work. Men like Fernand Duchamp did not have long to be overwhelmed. They had to get back to the work. The sabotage missions the resistance had been planning for were crucial to the success of the initial landings in ways that are still not fully appreciated in popular accounts of D-Day. The Allied planners understood that even if the beach landings went perfectly, the Germans would attempt to rush reinforcements to Normandy to overwhelm the beachhead before it could be consolidated. The key to preventing that was disrupting the German transportation network, specifically the railways. The French rail network was the fastest way to move armor and troops across the country. If the resistance could cut the lines, blow the bridges, derail the trains, and destroy the switching yards, German reinforcements could be delayed for days, possibly weeks. And days and weeks were exactly what the Allies needed to build up strength on the beaches. The plan was called Plan Vert, Green Plan, and it had been prepared for months. There was also Plan Tortue, Tortoise Plan, which targeted road networks, Plan Blue, which targeted electrical infrastructure, and Plan Violet, which targeted telephone and telegraph communications. On the night of June 5th and into June 6th, resistance cells across France executed these plans simultaneously. Bridges were blown. Railway lines were cut in dozens of places. Switching yards were sabotaged. Communication cables were severed. In some cases, German units that tried to move toward Normandy were delayed by hours or days because every route they tried had been interdicted. In at least one documented case, a German armored division that should have reached the Normandy coast within 24 hours of the landings took more than a week to arrive, because every time it tried to move by rail, it found the line cut, and when it tried to move by road, it found the bridge down or the fuel depot destroyed. This was the resistance's contribution, not glamorous, not visible on the day, but in its effect on the outcome, potentially decisive. And it happened in coordination with American paratroopers who had never met the people helping them, who in many cases didn't even know help was being rendered, who were fighting their own battles in the dark on the ground while, a few kilometers away, a farmer or a school teacher or a young woman in her 20s was blowing up a railway line with explosives she had been hiding under her barn floor for 6 months. The encounters between paratroopers and resistance fighters in those first hours sometimes had a quality that people who were there struggled to describe adequately afterward. There was something about the circumstances, the darkness, the danger, the noise of combat nearby, the weight of what was at stake, that stripped away everything that was not essential. Two people, usually strangers, from completely different backgrounds, meeting under conditions that were extraordinary by any measure, and in that meeting, finding something that neither of them had words for at the time. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole was a decorated officer of the 101st Airborne who would later win the Medal of Honor for his actions during the Normandy campaign. In the early hours of June 6th, Cole was trying to consolidate scattered men from his battalion near Saint-Mary-Église when he was approached by a Frenchman who identified himself simply as a member of the local resistance. The man spoke limited English. Cole spoke no French. Between them, using a combination of the man's broken English, a map, and a great deal of pointing, they managed to work out the positions of a German machine gun nest that was going to be a serious problem for Cole's unit if it wasn't dealt with. The information the Frenchman provided allowed Cole to maneuver around the position and neutralize it without taking the casualties that a direct frontal approach would have cost him. Cole said afterward that he never got the man's name. He never saw him again. But the information that man provided probably saved the lives of a dozen of his soldiers. That pattern, a resistance member appearing out of nowhere, providing information of critical tactical value, and then disappearing back into the landscape, played out repeatedly in those first days of the Normandy campaign. These were people who had spent years studying German positions, movements, and routines. They knew things about the local military situation that no Allied intelligence assessment could have replicated, because intelligence assessments are based on what you can observe from a distance. The resistance observed from inside. Jean Bouchard was 22 years old in June of 1944. She had been a courier for a resistance network since the age of 19, carrying messages and documents on her bicycle through German checkpoints, relying on the fact that a young woman on a bicycle was less suspicious to the German occupiers than a man on foot. She had been stopped and searched many times. She had memorized the documents she carried so that if she had to destroy them, the information would not be lost. She had done things that would have terrified most people and had trained herself not to show it, because showing fear at a checkpoint was how you got arrested. By June of 1944, she was experienced enough that fear had not gone away, she said, but it had become manageable, something she knew how to work with, rather than something that worked against her. On the morning of June 6th, she encountered her first American soldier. He was a paratrooper from the 82nd Airborne, sitting at the edge of a ditch with a badly sprained ankle, trying to figure out where he was. She was on her bicycle, heading toward a prearranged meeting point. She stopped. They looked at each other. She said she looked at this young man, obviously American, obviously frightened, obviously in pain, and she thought of her brother, who had been arrested by the Gestapo 2 years earlier and had not come home. She thought, this boy is here because of what happened to my brother. He is here because of everyone like my brother. He is here because of all of us. She helped him. She signaled to him to follow her. He hopped and limped behind her bicycle for half a kilometer until she got him to a house where she knew he would be safe, where 2 other resistance members were sheltering. She left him there and continued to her meeting. She said she did not say much to him. She did not cry. She did her job. But she said, when she got back on her bicycle and rode away from that house, she allowed herself one moment, just one. She looked up at the sky, which was now beginning to go gray with early morning light, and she said out loud, quietly, to no one in particular, Merci. Thank you. The village of Saint-Mère-Église has a particular place in the story of D-Day and of the resistance, because it was the first town in France to be liberated on June 6, 1944. And the circumstances of that liberation were chaotic, accidental, and in some ways representative of everything that happened that night. A house fire in the town square had drawn civilians out of their homes, and some paratroopers had landed directly in the town, into the light of the burning building, in full view of German troops who were stationed there. Several Americans were killed in the air, or immediately on landing. One man, Private John Steele of the 82nd Airborne, famously had his parachute caught on the church spire and hung there for over 2 hours, playing dead while the battle raged below him. He was eventually captured and then escaped. But among the chaos, the town's residents, including several members of a local resistance network, were doing what they could to help. Alexandre Renard, a pharmacist who had been passing intelligence to a resistance network for 3 years, moved through the town during the fighting, sheltering wounded paratroopers in his pharmacy, providing what medical help he could, and keeping people hidden from German soldiers who were conducting house-to-house searches in the hours following the initial landings. He did this while gunfire was active in the streets outside his door. He said afterward that he had felt no particular heroism in the moment. He said he had simply seen men who needed help and helped them. He said the thought of not helping them had never occurred to him. That phrase, the thought of not helping them, had never occurred to me, comes up again and again in accounts from French civilians and resistance members who encountered American paratroopers in those first days. There is something in it that goes beyond courage in the conventional sense. It speaks to a kind of moral clarity that comes from having lived under occupation for 4 years, having watched what happens when people do nothing, having seen what the alternative to resistance looks like. By June of 1944, the French people of Normandy, who had chosen to resist, had already paid enormous prices for that choice. They had buried friends, they had waited for family members who never came home from interrogations. They had lived with the knowledge that the wrong word, said to the wrong person, could end everything. That level of sustained commitment changes a person. It makes certain choices feel not like choices at all, but simply like what you do, because who you are no longer permits any other possibility. Not every French person in Normandy that night was a resistance fighter, and not every encounter was positive or simple. The Normandy campaign was also going to be devastating for French civilians, thousands of whom would be killed in the fighting and in the Allied bombing of Norman towns and infrastructure that preceded and accompanied the invasion. Some French people watching paratroopers descend over their farms and villages that night felt not just hope and relief but also fear, because they understood, correctly, that the arrival of American forces meant that their region was about to become a battlefield. And they were right. The Battle of Normandy, from June 6th to late August 1944, would kill somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 French civilians. Entire towns would be reduced to rubble. The liberation would come, but it would come at a terrible price paid in large part by the people who lived in the places where it happened. Yvette Mercier was a mother of 3 children, living on a farm near Carentan. She was not a resistance member. She was a farmer's wife who had spent 4 years trying to keep her children fed and safe while her husband was in a German prisoner of war camp in Germany. When the planes came over on the night of June 5th, she gathered her children and went to the cellar. She did not watch the paratroopers land. She did not feel the surge of hope and relief that people like Fernand Duchamp or Geneviève Dubois or Henri Fouché felt. She felt terror, because she had lived close enough to the realities of war to know what a battlefield does to everything in its path. She said later that she prayed for the soldiers falling from the sky. She prayed for her children, and she prayed that whoever was going to fight over her land would do it somewhere else. That prayer was not answered. Her farm was in the middle of the fighting for several weeks. Her house was destroyed. She and her children survived, sheltered by neighbors. When the Germans finally left and the Americans came through, she met an American soldier who helped her children and gave them chocolate and was very kind to her. She said she was glad they had come. She said she would have been glad no matter what. But she also said she wished there had been another way. That tension between gratitude for liberation and grief at the price of it runs through the experience of Normandy in 1944 and cannot be separated from the story of what the French felt when the paratroopers came. The joy was real. The relief was real. The sense that the long dark wait was finally ending was real. And it coexisted with loss, with fear, with the knowledge that more suffering was coming before it was over. The paratroopers themselves brought something with them beyond weapons and military capability. That the outside world had not forgotten. That the Allied powers were committed to doing what they had promised to do. That the propaganda that the German occupiers had been broadcasting for 4 years, telling French people that the Allies would never come, that de Gaulle was a fantasist, that resistance was futile, was wrong. Seeing those men fall from the sky was seeing that lie demolished in the most dramatic way imaginable. Pierre Lefebvre was a man in his 50s who had spent the occupation in a state of deep skepticism. He had not been a collaborator. He had also not been an active resistance member. He had been, as he described himself later, simply someone who tried to survive and keep his head down while hoping that someone else would fix things. He was not proud of this. He was honest about it. When the planes came over on the night of June 5th, he was watching from his window, unable to sleep. He watched the paratroopers come down over the fields near his village. He watched the firefights that followed, the tracer fire going back and forth in the darkness. And he said that watching this, he felt something he recognized as shame. Because those men coming down from the sky had come a very long way to fix things in a country that was not theirs. And he had spent 4 years waiting for someone else to do exactly that. He said the shame was useful, in its way. It was the beginning of something. He came out of his house the following morning and started helping. He was not a fighter, but he could move, he could carry, he could translate, he could direct. He spent the following weeks doing whatever was needed. He said he was not sure it made up for anything, but it was something. The question of what the French said in those moments is really a question about what words can carry when words are almost inadequate. Because the emotion of June 6, 1944, for the French people who experienced it, was not simple enough for a single phrase to contain. It was built from 4 years of accumulated grief and fear and determination and hope. When it finally broke open into 1,000 different expressions, in 1,000 different places, in 1,000 different voices. Some people wept, some prayed, some said nothing at all and simply reached out and touched the arm of a strange American boy and tried to put everything they felt into that one gesture. Some said thank you in accented English. Some said, ils sont venus, they came, to themselves or to each other, as if they needed to confirm that it was real. Some said things they later struggled to remember clearly, because the moment was too large for ordinary memory to hold intact. Marguerite Alençon, the farm woman who gave Thomas Wyatt bread and cheese and cold coffee in the early hours of June 6th, the woman whose words he tried to have translated later and couldn't quite reconstruct, apparently told someone else what she had said to that young American soldier with the rifle that she had gently pushed down toward the ground. She had said, in French, words that translate to approximately, "Don't be afraid, you are not alone anymore, and neither are we. Don't be afraid, you are not alone anymore, and neither are we." It's a simple sentence. It is not a famous quote. It has no monument. It is not printed in the history books, but it is, perhaps, as close as any single set of words gets to what passed between the French and the Americans in those extraordinary hours when the night sky over Normandy was full of parachutes and everything that had seemed impossible for 4 years suddenly became real. The cooperation between the resistance and the Allied forces on and immediately following D-Day has been studied by military historians and largely confirmed as having been significant to the outcome of the campaign. The sabotage operations delayed German reinforcements. The intelligence provided by resistance members helped Allied commanders understand the local situation more quickly than they could have through any other means. The practical assistance rendered to scattered paratroopers, the guides, the safe houses, the food, the medical help, saved an unknown but certainly significant number of lives. And the moral effect of finding, in that chaotic and terrifying environment, that the local population was not neutral, was not hostile, but was actively on your side and willing to die to prove it. That effect on the American soldiers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne cannot be quantified, but also cannot be dismissed. Sergeant Walter Oakes of the 101st Airborne came down in a flooded area near the Douve River and nearly drowned before he managed to pull himself to higher ground. He lost most of his equipment. He was alone. He was not sure where he was. He spent nearly 3 hours moving carefully through the darkness before he encountered another person. That person was a young Frenchman named Christophe Marais, who had been out that night because of the BBC signal and who had already helped one other American soldier before he found Oakes. Marais gave Oakes dry socks from his own bag, which he had brought specifically because he had been told paratroopers sometimes landed in the flooded areas and would need them. He had brought dry socks, in preparation, because he had thought about what these men might need when they arrived, and he had done what he could to prepare for it. Oakes said he did not have the words in French to say what that meant to him. He did not have the words in English either. He said he shook the man's hand for a long time. He said that the man looked him in the eyes and nodded, and he said that nod contained something that he thought about for the rest of his life. There is a kind of history that gets told in monuments and official narratives, and there is a kind of history that gets told in dry socks and nods, and a farm woman pushing a rifle barrel gently downward, and an old man saying thank you to the sky. Both are real. But the second kind is the one that tells you something true about what it means to be human in the middle of events that are larger than any individual human being. The French resistance was not perfect. It had its own politics, its own internal conflicts, its own failures and betrayals and ugly moments. The process of liberation itself would bring with it difficult episodes, summary executions, accusations of collaboration that were sometimes just and sometimes not, communities tearing themselves apart over what people had done or hadn't done during the occupation. The moral landscape of occupied France was not black and white, and anyone who claims otherwise is not being honest about the complexity of what it means to live under an authoritarian occupation and make choices about how to survive it. There were difficult compromises. There were people who did things they were ashamed of. There were resistors who made mistakes that cost innocent lives. All of that is true. And yet, on the night of June 5th to 6th, 1944, something happened that was, in its basic human dimension, as clear and as pure as anything in the history of the Second World War. People who had been waiting, suffering, and fighting in the dark for 4 years saw the men who were going to help them finally arrive. And the American boys who fell from the sky into that darkness found that the country below them was not empty, was not hostile, was not indifferent, but was full of people who had been keeping the flame alive, waiting exactly for this, and who were ready to do whatever it took to make sure that what was beginning that night would be completed. They had things to say about it. Some of them said those things out loud, in